think we'll make a start now. I've asked each of the speakers to respond to the other two as a way of kicking off our question and discussion time. So it's very generous of them to do that. So I think we'll go in the order in which we heard the talks, and if you just follow on one from the other, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So if you can think about your questions as the panel is making these very brief remarks, it won't be more than a few minutes. And if you queue up in the normal way at both of the microphones, that would be very helpful. So over to you, Anselma. Thank you.
So thank you, Elizabeth and Dan. Lots and lots of food for thought. I think my question to both of you is kind of the same question, and just in full disclosure, Dan and I began a conversation about this because it's one of my favorite topics as well that I'm beginning to think about. You know, we really want to do something about climate change. We want to show our love for the environment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, show our love for God through our love for nature and the poor and blah, blah, blah. But I feel strongly that there's perhaps a point that also needs to come to the conversation. So it's the question of the Sabbath. And so my own class that I'm teaching right now, when we looked at the Sabbath, we looked at Exodus 16. The people of Israel the Israelites have left Egypt, but they haven't arrived yet. So they're in this kind of transitional period. And there are two commands that they are required to adhere to. One is to not hoard the gifts God gives them. If they keep a hold of the manna, of course it spoils. And I think that's just such a great concrete image of where we're at right now. And the other is to observe the Sabbath with everything that means. Worship, rest, relaxation, savoring, what have you. And I feel that today we've lost touch with the Sabbath. I know that Catholics, of course, still have the Sunday Mass requirement, and the bishops obviously are promoting that, but you know, the Sabbath in the kind of fully lived sense. And so if you can talk about this in terms of the Sabbath as the way of wisdom, and then also in terms of the programming, et cetera, that you do, I'd appreciate hearing.
Okay. Yeah, we were talking about that yesterday morning, and I've been testing that idea, and where it came. I just need to tell a quick story, and someone's heard this, but when my son, who's now a freshman in high school, he was on our St. Ambrose CYO baseball team a couple years, and a couple years ago they kept scheduling games on Sundays. The CYO office was scheduling baseball games on Sundays. So I called the CYO office for the Archdiocese of Washington, and I said, why are you scheduling games on Sundays? Aren't we supposed to go to church? And some of the games were Sunday mornings, not just Sundays, Sunday mornings. And they said, well, that's the only time we can get the baseball fields. And I said, but this is the Catholic Youth Organization, right? Catholic? And the guy said, yeah. I said, well, shouldn't you try to encourage games on other days of the week besides Sundays? So he said, and they've been doing this for several years, he said, you're the first person that has ever called to complain about that. And I was both not surprised and very sad at the same time that we have really lost the notion of the Sabbath, the concept of the Sabbath. So as that thing sort of fermented in my head, I thought, you know, this is really the problem with the climate crisis. And I'm testing this theme, and I'd like to have your feedback about it. But I believe that the crisis of the climate crisis is a crisis of the Sabbath. I tested that with some youth, and they loved it. I think people are dying for someone to tell them to shut the computer off, to turn the television off, and to get outside and do something with your family in nature. And someone was saying yesterday, people have to make a choice on Sunday mornings. Do they want to sleep in to rest from the exhausting week, or should they go to church? If we have to make that choice, there's something profoundly wrong with our society. If we don't have the energy to get up and go to church, we have some problems. There was a study that came out from, I just had to pull it up, from the Center for, what's it called? Center for Economic Policy and Policy Research. The headline is, "New paper projects significant carbon emission reductions with fewer work hours." There's the concept of the Sabbath in there. There's a wonderful book that I highly recommend, very accessible to those of you who are brilliant academicians and those like me who don't get into this stuff too much. It's called 24/6, and it's by Dr. Matthew Sleeth, S-L-E-E-T-H, and he's an evangelical former ER doc who found Jesus and got on fire with creation care, and he wrote this book called 24/6, and he talks all about the biblical concept of the Sabbath and how we're violating that on a regular basis, and how our world, our health, our personal health, our family health, our whole world would be better if we set aside one day a week, doesn't have to be Sunday, one day a week, to stop and smell the roses. So those are some thoughts.
Matthew Sleeth's wife, I heard speak at a convention sponsored by Interfaith Power and Light in Columbus, Ohio last spring, and she actually was raised Jewish, and the Jewish tradition has stronger tradition of, especially the Orthodox Jews, of honoring and keeping the Sabbath than we Christians and Catholics have managed to do. So she grew up with that influence, and perhaps has influenced her husband's thinking in that regard. But along the lines of that, what we might learn from Jews of that Sabbath practice, I'm reminded by this discussion of an experience that I had last fall. I was driving around in Cincinnati, and found myself in a neighborhood that wasn't very familiar with, and I saw all these people walking in the middle of the streets, as if the streets were there for people and not for cars, and I didn't know what was going on, and I was curious, and I stopped, and there were families walking together, talking to each other. It was a beautiful fall day, and children were straying to go and pick up the leaves that had these beautiful bronze and red autumn colors. And then I realized what was going on. This was a very Jewish neighborhood of Cincinnati. These were people who were honoring the Sabbath and who were walking to their place of worship. And I thought, what a different experience that is than in my parish, where we all come in cars and go into church and walk out and get back in our cars and drive away. Here they are having this interaction with each other, an interaction with nature, enjoying this beautiful fall day as they walk to church, and they are not emitting CO2 in their process of getting to their place of worship. And they really are, in that sense, celebrating the Sabbath. And I think there's something that Catholics can learn from the Jewish observation of that practice of, that their principle is not to light a fire on the Sabbath. So what does that mean in the 21st century? One interpretation, there's different rabbinic interpretations, but one of them is it means you don't drive a car.
Thank you to all of you for raising that really fascinating issue. I want to abuse my position as chair to make a comment about the Sabbath as well. And that's because I used it when I was working for CAFOD. I've written on it in various places, but I used it in the practical context of speaking to MPs and peers in Westminster. They have a sort of special interest group on CAFOD, and I use this idea of Sabbath in order to encourage people to think about it. And I think it's hinted at what Elizabeth was saying there. It kind of crosses over different religious denominations and also different religious or not even non-religious denominations. And so this idea of the sanctification of time, which is what the Sabbath is all about, I think is really important as part of what you might call the practices that we need in order to engage, the wider community. So we move on now then to Elizabeth, and perhaps you can have a nugget of wisdom, a further wisdom for us in leading forward our discussion.
Well, I would like to make a connection between your paper, Anselma, and Dan Castillo's, who's sitting up there, paper on lamentation that he gave this morning. And he talked about the importance of lamentation, and there's what are we lamenting for? Is it only for ourselves, or is it also for the broader creation that is suffering in this anthropogenic era of climate change? Leopold, who she talks about, asked the question, how can we mourn for that which we do not know? And many of us in our society do not know the natural world. There was a astounding figure I saw in an article I read, that the average child in the United States can recognize like almost 1,000 different corporate logos, but can only identify 2 or 3 species. So we have this, we don't know in a contemplative way, in a sacramental way, the life that surrounds us, the creatures that surround us. And so I think that the wonderful work that Anselmo is presenting on the importance of the witness of these nature writers to help open our eyes, to develop contemplative practices, to learn to the natural world, and so that then we can feel more keenly that the suffering that's going on is not only the suffering of humans, but the plants and animals that are suffering from drought and from heat waves and all the other dimensions of climate change, and to mourn for them as well as for the human family. And St. Francis is also another great example of that Dan emphasized with his real compassion and care for creatures, and not just for the human species, but for the broader creatures who are, as Bonaventure said, representatives and embodiments of God's wisdom.
I could speak somewhat to that. I don't know if, Dan, if you want to come down or whatever, but you know, Richard Love, I believe it was, wrote the book about what he calls nature deficit disorder, you know, that kids don't get out in nature. And this is a problem on a variety of ways, including the fact that children develop autoimmune diseases more easily because they're not exposed to a variety of different microorganisms that would stimulate their immune systems. They're in this kind of sterile indoor environment all the time. I think with just looking at the United States, probably the rest of the world too, with the increasing urbanization, the challenge is going to be, how does one do this in an urban context? And I think the answer is probably to green urban spaces, to continue to green urban spaces. A lot of studies obviously have been done where there are parks, you know, there's less crime and everything. Admittedly, you know, the nature that's in urban areas is more than people think there is, although it's not what it used to be. I mean, the number of songbirds, et cetera, has vastly decreased, but it's still there. People could, you know, join in the Audubon Society annual, you know, population count of the birds, for example, you know, wherever they live, you know, whether it's Manhattan or South Bend. I know around here, I've lived in South Bend for 20 years, and I live really on the edge of the rural area. And there are still populations that do traditional things, such as keeping a garden or putting up a small harvest in homemade, you know, jars. They go hunting. There's still hunting season, and unfortunately, they do burn leaves. That's another traditional practice. But there's enough of that around that people get outside, and I just think that's a huge issue. And Leopold's absolutely right. How do you grieve for what you don't know? And how do you envision, you know, in Leopold's land ethic, the land ethic is a kind of a normative ethic, but prior to getting there, you have to re-envision, rename, redefine what humanity is. You know, a member of a biotic community, the way he uses it. Are you in a biotic community? Are we all inside these fabricated, everything you touch is human fabricated materials, you know, the carpeting, the walls, etc. It's all been made in a factory somewhere. Nothing is natural. And then I forget who the chef is, the British chef that went to the town in West Virginia. Right. Jamie Oliver. Yeah, Jamie Oliver, right. And so that was just a situation of just showing children vegetables and asking them to identify them, and they didn't know what the vegetables were. They didn't know what a potato was. They didn't know what a stalk of celery was. I mean, that's nature too. So there's a whole other, you know, thing that one can get into this through food, I'm sure, as well. But just a suggestion. I'd love to hear what other people say about this.
No, I'll not comment on that.
No, do you want to respond to
Yeah, so, well, I guess my question is, I've been interested. Dan, did you want to say something?
Sure, yeah, I can say something real quickly from the second tier up here, which is, I think there's a very, very close relationship between Sabbath and lament. And, Gutierrez talks about the language of prophecy and the language of contemplation, which Anselma referenced in her paper. And I think, in this context, we don't have space to lament. We don't have time to lament. And it's the Sabbath that, would allow us that space and that time. It's cultivating Sabbath so as to allow space for lament, and not just to stay in lament, but to move forward, and also to cultivate those relationships with parts of the earth that we too often just pass right through, pass by without noticing, so that we can have those connections, we can have experienced those connections in a way that we realize there's something to lament.
I guess my question is really, when we talk about, when Christ is the source and the summit, when we talk about all creation reflects God's image, it just strikes me that there are so many people, scientists especially, who were looking at, like I'm thinking of Brian Swim, Mary Evelyn, thank you, Mary Evelyn Tucker, and others who were looking at the story of the universe and how powerful that is to begin to think about the, from the great flaring forth, as Thomas Berry would say, to today, and how we are part of nature. We are stardust, really. And if we can begin to articulate that more clearly in Catholic theology and Catholic language, and make it more mainstream. Right now it seems like it's fairly on the fringes of Catholic thought, Catholic theology, but I don't follow it that closely, so I would be interested in your comments on some of that.
Well, I find that students are really interested in cosmology, and in that they usually don't know the story of the universe in the broad scale, except in very general terms, or the amazing character of how, from the Big Bang forward, life evolved and under very improbable circumstances. And one of a Franciscan participant from Santa Clara at your conference last.
Oh, Keith Warner.
Yeah, he was saying about how he teaches that in his ecology class in Santa Clara, and he finds that putting themselves in the context of this bigger cosmos and the cosmic history really helps students who are struggling for a sense of spiritual meaning and understanding their place in God's creation, that it's really spiritually important to them.
Thank you very much, everybody. I think we've now got just two more brief comments in relation to Dan's paper, if you wish to ask any questions from the panel first.
I think I did mine with the
You've done it already.
questions.
Okay, so that's fine. Just checking that that's we've dotted all the T's, crossed all the T's. Does anyone like to come forward now to ask questions to either to the panel or anyone else, or make comments, suggestions?
I think we're on. Yes. Thanks, Dave Titley, and first, thanks for having me here. I'm not a Catholic, so I hope this isn't an inappropriate question. But I have lived in large bureaucracies for a long time, and there seems to be some similarities between large bureaucracies and the Catholic Church. So there's been a leadership change very recently, and with leadership changes come opportunity. So I listened to what Dan was talking about, and and it's amazing type things, and we've heard the intellectual underpinnings for decades are very, very solid. So my question is kind of tactical. How does, without becoming an environmental organization, but remaining a church, but how does this issue sort of become, if not top 3, at least top 5? Because if it's not, then it's into the everything's important and therefore nothing's important phase. So is it, I mean, we have representatives from 2 universities on the panel. Is it through the universities of the Catholic Church? Is it through the sort of the bishops to the archbishops? Or how is it that we sort of, the collective we, would make this message one of the leadership's top parts, similar to what the Secretary of the Navy's done with energy? The Navy's a Navy, but he's made energy a really big deal. So how does this become a big deal at the top to then energize that huge mass of people that, Dan, you talked about? Thanks.
Well, the new Pope Francis barely shut his mouth on the first night that he was elected, and I was jokingly texting my staff to say that we're going to change it to the Pope Francis pledge. And then I also said that his inaugural mass was all about preaching about the St. Francis pledge, because he talked about care for creation and care for the poor. So we're claiming complete credit for the inspiration of the Holy Spirit on this cardinals. But anyway, I think it does have a lot to do with top leadership. I think it has to do with, and I was so encouraged to hear that at your church in Princeton that there's a lot more talk from the pulpit about the environment, even in the short amount of time that he's been our Pope. I think there will be some significant leadership from him on the environment, and I think that a lot of pastors and hopefully the bishops will follow that. So that's one answer. The other answer is, and this goes back to a question that a gentleman asked earlier about I never hear about this from my pastor, you know. My sort of glib response to that is, what's your relationship like with your pastor? There's 2 staff for the coalition. There's 75 million Catholics. That's 32.5 million each. I'm not sure we're going to get very far. But there's 8,000 people who've taken the St. Francis Pledge. That's got to be at least 1/3 of the parishes in the country. So, so developing your relationship with your pastor to encourage him to talk about these issues, I think, is really important. And I think it's 1,000 blooms. I mean, wherever there's some work going on, let's highlight it. Let's make it good news. Let's not get too down on ourselves about it. But I think it is going to take some time. Those are all the kind of the expected answers. I think one of the unexpected answers I would give to that is, I'm afraid that it's going to take a lot more Sandys and a lot more epic droughts and epic floods for people to start paying attention to that. And I think as pastors begin to deal with the pastoral needs of people who have lost their homes, who have lost their livelihoods, who have lost their lives, I think it's going to be tough, frankly.
Yep.
Yes, my name's John Combs, and I just really had a couple of observations on the point of our getting out and enjoying nature and becoming more familiar with it. The Franciscan Action Network has a 6-part program that they've developed, training program, that is on Franciscan care for creation. And my parish and our neighbor parish went in together and did that last fall. And one of the 6 lessons is, how can we fall in love with nature? And they have a series of activities that you could do, and we've done a couple of them. One is that I'm a birder, so we went out and did a bird walk together. And I think that energized a lot of people about appreciating the bird life. But almost every Audubon group in the country, and they're everywhere, is interested in getting new members. So I think if you're interested in that kind of thing, you contact them or look for them on a web page and contact them. And I think they'll have a series, our club certainly has a series of walks scheduled in every season. So that would be one way. And a second thing that we did was trying to control non-native invasive plants, which are threatening our native plants. And we got a fair number of people to come out, and we went over the church grounds and identified what were those non-native species, and then took some action to control them. The other observation that I, playing on your comment about the dramatic reduction in bird life, and there is, many birds have had as much as a 70% reduction in the size of their population. And there's a really good book by a fellow by the name of Douglas Tallamy from the University of Delaware. He's a entomologist, and he has a very good book called Bringing Nature Home. And his point is that the #1 reason for that decline is loss of habitat. And we can't, you know, stop people building homes and shopping centers and whatnot, but with our own homes and with our own businesses and with our own shopping centers, if we plant native plants, we can mitigate some of that loss of habitat. And what will be wonderful from the point of view of experiencing nature is, as we get more native plants, we'll get more native birds and butterflies and dragonflies into our own yards. Then we can enjoy them and identify more with nature then. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
John, yeah.
This is a question about the bishop's statement. It's been said that the only way to preserve knowledge is to increase it, and it seems to me that one of the reasons that statement is not well known now is that it's 12 years old, which is a long time in the world of climate, and I wonder if any of the panelists have any thoughts about why there's not been a major updating of that statement, or if the prospects might be good for one.
That's a question for Dan.
Yeah.
You work for the bishop.
Yeah, start with the guy who worked for the bishops. The bishops' conference is averse to writing new statements these days. I mean, there's very few statements that come out of the bishops' conference as a rule. But I would say that the principles, and I would say that, you know, probably 80% of that statement would not change, because I think it has a bit of a timeless quality to it. You know, obviously the science has changed, there's more certainty and all of that, so you could change the appendix and, you know, some of the sidebar-ish, the things that are in the statement. But I frankly think you could read it today, and I think it would be as relevant as it was 12 years ago. So I don't think they're going to be writing a new statement, and I'm not even sure that we need one. And yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Hi, my name is Michaela. I'm from New Mexico. I'm involved in Catholic school on an elementary level, and we're trying to implement a lot of what's going on. I want to thank you, Dan. We use your website all the time. And so far, we've implemented 2 recycling programs, a bird feeding program, a beautification project, and along with this goes educating the kids about what the plants are. And they know what arugula is now. Many of the teachers know what arugula is now. So it's going slowly. I would say the easiest part is the actual tangible things you can do, like recycling, but getting the teachers to absorb the Catholic social teaching on the environment and then reformulate for that for the students has been much harder, and with good reason. They're busy enough as it is. So that's really what we've run into. So we're going to start our 2nd year and really focus on that. That's why we haven't taken the pledge yet, because we feel like the school doesn't understand it. And they'll sign it in a minute, but I don't think they'll do it. So that's what we're waiting for. But one of my observations is that, especially yesterday, a lot of the scientists, it was sort of divided. Well, we're the scientists and nobody will listen to us. What can the literary people do and the theologians? And I think this is a big problem with the state we're in anyway. We can't just lament ourselves. We have to lament all of creation. It's the whole connection between the Doritos and the weight problem and the lack of being in touch with nature. So I'm just really struck by all the separations, and that one thing that we can bring I think, as a church community is that wholeness. And that, I know it's hard in science. I mean, it's hard to speak as a Catholic anywhere because of suspicion, but and as a Catholic scientist, they must really get some, but why can't we speak as Catholic scientists? For those who are, or whatever. Maybe if they got up in church and said, I'm a scientist, global warming is happening. I just wonder if we can be more integrated with our approach to everything and emphasize the connections, then that might follow more fully. One thing we're trying to teach the kids in school is they go to Mass on Friday and then they go back to working. We want to incorporate the sacrament of the Eucharist in their whole day. How do we do that? So we're trying to get the holistic image, and I don't know if you have any observations or recommendations, but I just wanted to make that comment and also to say thank you for your work.
Do you want to speak to that with the science?
Well, just to say that a holistic understanding speaks to me very much of the term wisdom, and that in a sense is about integrating rather than fragmenting where we're from. So, but let's have another question.
Well, it's actually a comment. One of the, when you were mentioning 3 different natural writers, I was hoping you would also mention Rachel Carson. Not really for Silent Spring, but for her other books, which are so poetic and really draw you into nature. I think people forget that she's written those books.
Right, yeah. I selected those 3 because they were at 3 different locations in the 20th century, and you know, the different things that were happening then. It's part of a longer work that I'm working on, but yeah, but thank you very much.
And then the other thing is, I think there's an irony when we're talking about, like Richard Love wanting to get kids back into the green nature. We are experiencing a huge influx of artificial turf. And I mean, it's just a phenomenon to me, because here we have this plastic grass, which has what they call crumbs, which is made from recycled tires, which off-gas, bad things, toxins. And here we are, it's just, so I'm just sharing that with just the reality and, all the different ways we're still struggling.
Yes, no, thank you very much. Yeah, as the climate gets more and more severe, and so then people run back indoors because there's a hurricane outside or something, so.
Hi, I'm Catherine Rudy, and I'm a graduate student at Taylor University. And 2 things. One, I was wondering if there's access to your presentations anywhere online, or they were so dense and wonderful, but I would love if you could comment on that, if that's possible. And then I wanted to say today, I think I heard a message that I wasn't expecting to hear and that I don't normally hear, that I was encouraged about the really individual aspect of your approach to all of this, that we can come as individuals and be changed, and also the corporate church, this idea of confession and lamentation, and that this can be part of the solution. And I'm wondering if you'd say that's where you think the main thrust of the church's response to this climate issue is. Is that where you see salvation, so to speak, not to over-spiritualize if that's possible with this group, but how you see, I mean, is that where you think we should be working? And I find that message encouraging, but I'm wondering if that's what you're really saying.
Do you mean targeting individuals?
Yeah, I mean, today is about theology instead of public policy, but it seems like, I mean, you're counting in hundreds of people and being excited about that message, and I like that. So I'm just wondering if that's where you guys are at.
When you just look at change, again, this is a discussion, a question I raised for my class. What was it about a woman all by herself who sat down on a bus? No biggie, right? Happens all the time. That started this cascade. It's because the individual is, of course, intrinsically connected, to everything else. And I think that's why the individual is so important. There's a reason why, for Catholics at least, the sacrament of reconciliation is an individual thing. One confesses sins in number and kind. It's very, very concrete. You don't sin in the abstract. I think that's the biggest challenge with climate change, actually, is our sins are so large and vast, they get very abstract. But it comes down to these individuals. And individually, all of those cars were turning over every morning, all of those computers were firing up, all these individual things, this individual stuff we have that we hoard and we can't stop using, eventually has this large, effect. I just think that in the Catholic imagination, again, to cite, Dan Castillo's paper, just this idea that the individual and the corporate are connected very, very intrinsically. You have the image that always runs through of, the medieval cathedral where every piece is so individual and tiny, and every tiny bit of that cathedral absolutely belongs there. And that's the way we can think of it as well, that when you see that medieval cathedral, you see the whole thing, this beautiful mosaic of everything, but you also see the individual pieces. And I guess in the modern world, the individuals have kind of been sort of run roughshod over by the corporate machine, et cetera. But I think that's why the individual is supremely important. Christ is an individual, and Christ is also all of us. So I don't know if you want to speak to that, but.
I think you put that very eloquently, Anselma, and the cathedral is a beautiful image of that. But I think that one of the core truths of Catholicism is that we are both unique persons and also inseparably bound to one another in the body of Christ. And Catholicism offers a vision of who we are as human persons and relationship with the rest of creation that's distinct from both the individualism of Western culture and the kind of collectivism of kind of a collectivist or Soviet Marxist kind of approach to anthropology. And it's one of the beauty of holding these together, that they're both important and that and inseparable. And in terms of the papers, this conference that Dan organized at the Catholic University of America last fall, Anselma presented her paper there, and there's a volume edited by Jamie Schaefer of Marquette University, that's the one he mentioned, that will be coming out this summer, and her paper, and my paper will be in that volume.
But this has been recorded, right?
That's
so
right.
There'll be
2 weeks approximately. All of these talks will be available on the Riley Center website. So, go ahead.
I think we have time for maybe just one more question. We've got queuing up, so I can't see any more people in the queue. So,
My name is Jim Myers. I am a Sulpician priest who has the good fortune of being on sabbatical this year here at the University of Notre Dame, returning to where I did my theological studies some time ago. Just a brief word of explanation. So we Sulpicians are diocesan priests who are released from our service within geographic diocese to dedicate ourselves to initial and continuing formation of priests. So we work with seminaries and seminarians, and my focus has been with priests after ordination. Now, given that background, in terms of both, I think, David, you had raised a question about strategy and opportunity, and Daniel, you and your assistant or your co-worker in the office. Another area I think that may be important for consideration for targeting for development is seminaries. You get a lot of potentially a lot of bang for buck. Yeah. If you start working with the people who are going to be preaching and working with the people of God. You've certainly had my mind spinning in creative ways about how I can engage my little portion of that effort going forward. But that would be, one comment would be strategically, would be in terms of the coalition to maybe see if there are ways of connecting with seminaries as well as schools and dioceses and universities. Another thing, my other comment would be how much I appreciate this discussion this afternoon, and its shift not only to include information and good education, but also to shift more into formation. Because when we talk about wisdom and the Sabbath and enjoying nature and even cosmology, that beneath this is the desire for a sense of who we are and how we can develop and flourish together in the world. So that this discussion for me has been a very important component of the conference, of including not only good information and education, but also a particularly Catholic approach to formation in our various environments. Thank you.
I'll buy you dinner if you tell me how to get into the seminaries. We've tried, and everybody wants to get to the seminary, and so therefore nobody gets to the seminaries. That's been my experience, but let's talk.
I think that is a really good note to end on, that there's more yet to come. So I'd like to thank all our panelists for their generosity, not only in presenting their paper, but being prepared to respond on the hoof to one another's papers and answer all these questions that you have. But they'll be available, I'm sure, later now and maybe tomorrow for any more questions you may have. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to our panelists.